the Tennessee hills, but a heavy, choking stillness, the kind that made grown men stop mid-step and mothers pull their children closer without knowing why. The overseers would later swear that even the wind refused to move the moment she took her very first breath. A slave girl born with one ice-blue eye and one deep ash-brown eye, a sight so unnatural, so unsettling, that the midwife dropped the cloth in her hands and backed away as if touched by death itself. From that day forward, the plantation called her one name only, Witch Eyes. No one spoke her birth name again. In the 1800s rural South, where superstition traveled faster than truth, anything unusual was immediately branded dangerous. A crooked shadow, an unexplained chill, a sudden whisper in the dark, and every eye turned suspicious. But nothing inspired more fear, more whispered prayers, more sleepless nights than a slave child whose eyes looked as though they belonged to two different people. The slaves said she carried the sky in one eye and the underworld in the other. The masters said she was born cursed. Children said she could see ghosts, and the old ones said she saw things other humans were never meant to see. But the truth was far stranger than any rumor. By the time she learned to walk, animals reacted to her before she even got close. Dogs hid behind barrels, whining with their tails tucked. Horses reared up wildly, froth gathering at their mouths whenever her mismatched gaze met theirs. Even cattle veered to the far end of the field, eyes rolling with instinctive panic. Overseers tried forcing animals to get used to her, but every attempt failed, and one ended so badly it became plantation legend. The mistress of the plantation, a rigid woman who believed everything could be disciplined, once demanded the girl feed the horses. The moment the child stepped into the stable, all 8 horses erupted in chaos, kicking, screaming, slamming their hooves into walls. One horse snapped its halter rope clean in half. The stable boy later said it felt like the devil himself walked in wearing a child's skin. Word spread fast, and fear spread faster. By 9 years old, she could not walk across a yard without someone signing the cross or muttering a prayer under their breath. Some slaves believed she could cure illnesses with a look, others believed she caused them. When a fever swept through the cabins, killing 2 field hands and a child, the mistress declared it was a curse brought by the girl. But the strangest part wasn't the fear others had of her, it was the way she seemed to sense things before they happened. A barn fire that erupted without warning. She had stood outside it 10 minutes earlier, staring blankly before whispering, "It's burning." A drunken overseer who suddenly fell dead from a stroke, she had refused to walk near him that morning, saying he won't finish the day. A woman who miscarried, she had placed a hand on her belly and quietly whispered, "I'm sorry," hours before the pain began. These moments were not ignored. They became stories, stories that turned into warnings, warnings that turned into fear, and fear in the South of the 1800s was more powerful than truth. By her teenage years, the legend of Witch Eyes spread beyond the plantation. Neighboring farms refused to hire any worker who lived near her cabin. A traveling doctor who inspected the slaves wrote a secret note about her condition, then abruptly quit the plantation the next morning without taking payment. Even traveling traders avoided looking at her, muttering that her eyes unsettled the soul. Then came the day she was placed on the auction block. Normally the auction yard roared with voices, men shouting bids, slapping hats against their knees, arguing over age and muscles and breeding. But when she stepped onto the platform, a cold, unnatural hush fell over the crowd. Dozens of men who had been bidding fiercely minutes earlier simply turned their eyes away. Not a single hand raised. Not a single voice called a price. Not a single bid dared to break the silence. Because everyone knew the legend. Everyone had heard the whispers. And no one wanted to bring home the girl with the sky in one eye and the underworld in the other. This was the beginning of the darkest, strangest mystery the Tennessee plantations ever recorded, and the story of the slave they only called Witch Eyes. The signs began long before anyone understood what they meant. The night she was born, the Tennessee sky turned heavier than storm clouds, dark enough to make even the bravest overseer pause mid-step. The old women later said the air tasted like metal, and the night creatures, the crickets, the owls, even the frogs, went silent the moment the first scream of labor tore through the slave cabins. Mariah, the child's mother, screamed so violently that the walls trembled, and with every cry, a strange stillness pressed itself against the world outside. When she finally delivered the baby, the midwife froze, The newborn did not cry, did not thrash, did not even blink at first. Instead, she opened her eyes wide, one a piercing celestial blue, the other a deep, earthy brown, and stared at the midwife with unnerving calm. Aunt Hester felt her heart drop into her stomach. In all her years, she had delivered babies deformed, sick, premature, even stillborn, but never one that looked as though two different spirits stared out of her face. She wrapped the child quickly and stepped outside for air. But the moment the baby crossed the threshold, the women gathered around her recoiled. Someone gasped. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else muttered, "No, no, no, this ain't right." When a sliver of cloth slipped aside, and the mismatched eyes glinted in the lantern light, a ripple of fear spread through the group like a wave breaking on rock. By dawn, the entire plantation knew about the infant with the sky in one eye and the underworld in the other. No one dared use her birth name after that. They simply called her Witch Eyes. From the very beginning, strange things circled around her like a shadow that refused to lift. The cabin she lived in remained colder than the others, even in July heat. The oil lamps flickered for no reason, sometimes burning too bright, sometimes going out completely. Tools went missing only to reappear in odd places. Chickens refused to scratch near her cabin. Dogs barked at night but fell silent the second she was carried outside. The old mule brayed whenever Mariah walked past with a child in her arms. You could believe in curses or not, but the fear was real, and in those days, fear was as powerful as scripture. As she grew, the unease around her deepened. She did not cry like normal babies. She did not babble. She sat upright as soon as she could, watching the world with an intensity far beyond her age. Even children sensed something and stayed away from her. Women avoided breastfeeding near her. Men lowered their heads when she looked at them. It wasn't that she misbehaved. She was quiet, almost too quiet. But the silence around her always felt wrong, unnatural, as if she carried an invisible presence that followed her like a second shadow. When she was barely a year old, the midwife found her awake at midnight, staring out the open doorway into pitch darkness. Her tiny finger pointed outward, as though tracking something only she could see. But outside there was nothing. No movement, no animal, no person. Yet when Aunt Hester stepped through the door to check, an icy chill hit her face so sharply she inhaled with a jolt. She backed away instantly, lifted the child, and refused to enter the cabin alone again. As she learned to walk, animals reacted first. The dogs tucked their tails and hid behind barrels. Horses reared up violently if she got too close. Cattle shifted away in tight groups, eyes wide, snorting nervously. One day, a young stable hand tried to bring her near the horses to teach them not to fear a child. The moment she stepped inside the stable, every horse erupted into chaos, kicking, screaming, slamming against stalls with such force that boards cracked. One horse tore its halter rope and nearly trampled the stable hand. After that day, no one allowed her near animals again. Rumors turned to stories, stories turned to warnings, and warnings turned into fear. By 5 years old, she sensed things before they happened. A field hand broke his leg hours after she stared at him for a long moment and whispered, "Don't climb." A barn fire erupted 15 minutes after she stood outside it, murmuring, "Red coming." A woman miscarried the same night the girl touched her belly gently and said, "I'm sorry." No one could explain how she knew. No one wanted to. When the plantation doctor visited to assess the slaves for auction value, he took one look at her eyes and froze. He examined her silently, then asked to speak to the master privately. Whatever he said in that room left the master pale and tight-jawed. The doctor left the plantation the next morning without taking payment and never returned again. By the time she reached 10 years old, her presence was a burden the plantation wanted to forget, but could not escape. Other plantations refused to buy or trade with any group she belonged to. Traders avoided walking past her. Even the mistress, who was strict but rational, refused to allow the girl near the house. And yet, despite all the fear, no one dared harm her. They believed doing so would wake the curse fully. When she was finally taken to auction, thin, quiet, dressed in worn cloth, every man who had been bidding moments earlier fell silent. The auctioneer shouted her age. The crowd lowered their eyes. The auctioneer tried again, louder. No one raised a hand. Not one. Even strangers felt the weight of those eyes on their souls. The silence, heavy and thick, stretched until the auctioneer's voice faltered. Everyone knew the truth. No one wanted to bring home the girl who saw too much, the girl born under an omen, the girl they had always called witch eyes. Plantation masters were not men who feared easily. They commanded hundreds, ordered whippings without blinking, bought and sold families as if livestock, and moved through life believing they were the center of every world they touched. But even the most ruthless of them carried an old Southern superstition deep inside their bones, a belief that signs and omens were not to be ignored. And nothing disturbed them more than a slave whose presence felt unnatural. The first time Master Silas Carrington saw the girl with the two different eyes, he felt something he could not explain, a discomfort so sharp it forced him to step back before he realized he had moved. She was only 7 when he noticed her closely for the first time. She didn't speak, didn't fidget, didn't smile. She only watched, her blue eye cold as a winter sky, her brown eye deep as a muddy river, both staring up at him as though she saw through every lie he had ever told, every whip he had ever cracked, every piece of cruelty he tried to justify. Most children looked down in fear or obedience. She did neither. She simply existed with an unsettling stillness, as if she belonged to some world beyond his understanding. Silas scoffed about her appearance at first, when the other slaves whispered, but months passed, and small events began to occur, events that the master could not rationalize, no matter how desperately he tried. His prized horse, strong, obedient, worth more than 2 seasons of cotton, collapsed the same night the girl stood at the fence watching the stables, her mismatched eyes glowing faintly in moonlight. No reason, no sickness, no wound. The animal simply fell and died before sunrise. The stable boy swore the horse was fine hours earlier. Silas slapped him for lying, but in his stomach he felt something else, dread. Then came the night when his bedroom mirror shattered in the dark, though no one had touched it. The sound woke the entire house. When he went outside the next morning to inspect the grounds, he saw the girl standing near the tree line, staring directly at his window as if she had been watching him sleep. Her expression didn't change. She didn't run. She just looked, and he felt his heart beat harder than he liked. That same week, the overseer's son nearly drowned in the river. He claimed a cold hand pulled him down, a grip so strong he couldn't scream. Hours before the boy went swimming, the witch-eyed girl had warned him in her soft, emotionless voice, "Don't go near the water today." He mocked her, called her strange, and walked away laughing. After his near death, he refused to speak her name again. Silas began avoiding her without admitting he was doing so. Whenever he saw her across the yard, he would turn away. Whenever she passed near the cotton fields, he watched her from a distance, pretending he was inspecting crops. But deep down, he knew he was watching to make sure she didn't look his way. For if she did, a coldness crawled up the back of his neck that no summer heat could melt. Other plantation owners started noticing things too. When neighboring masters came to visit, she would sometimes wander into sight, standing behind a fence, perched near the well, or sitting silently under the shade of a tree. Her mismatched eyes always caught attention. Some men stiffened, some muttered under their breath. One refused to get off his carriage and demanded to leave immediately. Another whispered that children born with such eyes were signs of a split soul, cursed before birth. Another said she looked like someone who had seen death and kept its secrets. Silas laughed at them in public, but listened closely in private. One afternoon, a wealthy plantation owner from Georgia named Harrington visited, hoping to trade mules. When the witch-eyed girl walked past the porch where they sat, Harrington instantly froze. His cigar dropped from his hand to the floorboards. He stared at her with an expression Silas had never seen on the man, a mixture of fear and recognition. When she disappeared behind the barn, Harrington stood abruptly, pale and sweating. Silas asked if he was unwell. Harrington cleared his throat and said, "That child should not be here." Silas frowned. "What do you mean?" Harrington avoided his eyes. "I've seen eyes like that once before. In Savannah, a child with 2 different colors. Folks said she brought sickness to every house she entered." Silas scoffed. "You believe that foolishness?" Harrington met his gaze with a seriousness that silenced him. "Foolish or not, the family that owned her burned down within a year." He left without finishing his cigar. He didn't return the following season. He didn't even send a trade request. Silas tried to forget the conversation, but the words stuck in his mind. He stopped allowing the girl near the main house. He ordered the women to keep her away from the kitchen yard. He even warned the overseer not to let her wander near the fields. But even with distance, he felt her presence like a shadow always a few feet behind him. Whenever he made a decision that would bring harm to someone, he swore he saw her reflection in a window or heard her whisper in the wind outside his office. Sometimes, when he passed her unexpectedly, she would look up with those mismatched eyes, and something inside him would twist. Guilt he didn't want, fear he couldn't admit, shame he thought he had buried. He hated that feeling. He hated her for causing it. It was easier to believe she was cursed than to accept that a young girl could strip him of his power simply by looking at him. The other masters who visited felt it too. Some refused to stay for dinner. Others would not shake Silas's hand unless she was out of sight. One man asked openly if Silas planned to dispose of the omen. Silas didn't answer. But in the private darkness of his thoughts, he wanted to, because he feared her more than he feared God, sin, or death. A child should not have that effect on men who ruled entire worlds. Yet she did, and over time the legend grew. Not even the plantation masters, men who feared nothing, could look into her eyes without feeling something inside them break. She did not choose the name that followed her like a shadow. It began as a whisper, small, uncertain, too fragile to speak aloud in daylight. Children murmured it first, hiding behind barrels or tree trunks as she passed. They were afraid to let her hear it, but somehow she always did. She would stop, turn her head slowly, and look at them with those mismatched eyes that seemed to carve straight through their skin and bone. The children would scatter, hearts racing, feet stumbling over roots and stones, convinced she could read their thoughts. Witch eyes. The words grew stronger with time, rolling off tongues that once hesitated. It clung to her like a second skin, one she could never shed. No matter where she walked, near the well, through the yard, past the laundry lines, mothers would pull their children close. Even the bravest men shifted away when she approached. It wasn't that she spoke curses or made threats, she hardly spoke at all. But there was something in her silence that pressed on people, made them uncomfortable in their own bodies. She carried an aura, and though nobody could explain it, everyone felt it. The slaves believed names carried power, and this one did. They said a name shaped a destiny, and hers had been written the moment she opened those mismatched eyes at the midwife. They whispered she was born already seeing two worlds, one human, one unseen. Sometimes at night, when the cabins glowed softly with lantern light, the older slaves would gather around a fire pit and tell stories. They spoke of ancient legends, spirits that slipped between bodies, souls caught between heaven and earth, omens carried by children who never cried at birth. Every story, no matter how distant, somehow circled back to her. When she overheard them, she did not react. She would sit a little distance away, knees pulled to her chest, watching the flames dance. Fire reflected differently in each of her eyes, blue shimmering like ice under heat, brown burning like embers buried deep. The firelight never warmed her expression. She remained still, too still, as though the world moved around her while she remained untouched by its rhythm. She learned early that people feared what they could not understand. Whenever she walked into a room, conversations died. Whenever she stood behind a group, shoulders stiffened. Even Mariah, her own mother, loved her with trembling hands. There was no cruelty in her mother's distance, only fear. A mother is supposed to know her child like her own breath, but Mariah confessed in broken whispers that she never felt the girl was entirely hers. It was as if something else had claimed the child first. The name Witch Eyes spread beyond the cabins soon enough. Overseers used it openly, though with unease tightening their voices. One even joked once that she looked like she could charm crops dead just by staring. Nobody laughed. Another avoided her path so sharply he tripped and fell into a pile of firewood. When she reached out a hand to help him up, he scrambled back, shaking his head violently. She lowered her hand slowly, her face expressionless, but a flicker of something, hurt, maybe, passed through her eyes for barely a second. The plantation mistress hated the name most, not because she believed it was untrue, but because she believed it fit too well. She forbade the slaves from saying it where she could hear. She insisted the child be called by her given name, though no one dared speak it aloud anymore. The mistress claimed she refused to live in a house where childish superstition dictated daily life. Yet even she avoided being alone near the girl. She would send servants ahead to check if the girl was nearby before stepping outside. When the girl appeared in hallways, the mistress would stiffen, gather her skirts, and take a detour no matter how inconvenient. But the name did not weaken. It grew stronger, spreading beyond the property lines. Traders spoke of the girl with two different eyes. Wagon drivers repeated the tales at crossroads. Slaves from neighboring plantations whispered the story during nighttime meetings in the woods. Some came just to catch a glimpse of her, standing behind a tree trunk, peering at her as if she were some wandering spirit wearing the shape of a child. She ignored their stares, their fear, their fascination. She had grown used to eyes following her the way dogs chased shadows. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, violent, electric, thick with humidity. The sky cracked open with lightning that lit the entire yard white. She stood in the rain, barefoot, arms dangling at her sides, staring straight at the heavens as if the storm had come just for her. The slaves yelled for her to come inside. She didn't move. Rain poured into her eyes, but she didn't blink. When lightning struck the old sycamore tree just feet away, splitting it in half, the slaves screamed and ducked. She did not flinch. That night, the whispers turned to certainty. Witch Eyes didn't fear storms. Storms feared her. After that, nobody dared call her by her birth name again. Even Silas Carrington never uttered it. He pretended it was because she was insignificant, but in truth, he didn't like how her real name felt in his mouth. It felt wrong, like trying to name something that did not belong to this world. And she began to carry herself differently too. The more the name followed her, the more she seemed to grow into it. Her silence became heavier, more intentional. Her glances became slower, as though measuring people. Her footsteps became almost soundless. She would wander alone at dusk, drifting to the edges of the fields where shadows stretched long and thin. Some claimed they saw her speaking to empty air. Others swore they saw her standing in the same spot at dawn and again at midnight as if she didn't sleep at all. The name clung to her until it became her identity, shaping how others saw her and how she saw herself. Not a girl, not a child, not a simple slave born into a cruel world, but something else, something not fully understood, something watched with awe and fear. By the time she turned 11, the whisper was no longer a whisper. Witch Eyes had become a legend whispered even by men who believed in nothing. Because, sometimes, it only takes one glance into eyes that don't match to realize the world holds more than flesh and bone. The first rumor did not begin in any church, plantation, or courthouse. It began in a cornfield, exactly where most whispered lies are born in the South, between people who worked long hours, feared their masters, and only felt safe speaking their truth when their voices were low, their backs bent, and their eyes fixed on the soil. All it took was one person looking into the child's mismatched eyes, one blue like split ice, one brown like churned mud, and stepping back as if they had seen something crawling behind her pupils. That flinch became a story, and that story became a warning. By the time she turned 6, the name Witch Eyes was spoken more often than her real name. Women clutching their babies when she walked past. Overseers pretending not to stare, but always staring too long. Slaves whispering prayers under their breath, not out of hatred, but out of the deep superstition that ruled their world far more than any written Bible. The South was a place where belief was more powerful than fact. And belief, once it rooted itself in fearful minds, grew like tangled weeds no one could pull out. Children were always the first to absorb fear. They ran from her as though afraid her gaze could freeze them. They dared each other to touch her hand, then shrieked when they actually did. Some said if you stared into her left eye too long, you would see your own death reflected back. Others swore the blue eye was the one she used to see spirits, while the brown one was for humans. It did not matter that none of this made sense. In Tennessee, logic had never been stronger than superstition. Adults were worse. They watched her silently, the way people watch a storm forming on the horizon, too afraid to turn away, too unsure whether it would pass or swallow everything. The midwives, who had delivered hundreds of babies, all claimed they had never seen eyes like hers. One said she must have been marked by something unnatural. Another insisted the devil placed a fingerprint on the child's face before she took her first breath. And once that kind of language entered the conversation, there was no containing it. Rumors traveled faster than horses in the 1800s. They rolled across plantations, skipped through towns, and carried themselves across state lines like invisible riders. A black child with 2 different colored eyes might have been curious news in another place, But in Tennessee, where fear of curses, witches, and omens simmered beneath daily life, it was an earthquake. Churches whispered about her before they ever saw her. Preachers warned their congregations that evil sometimes comes not as a shadow but as a child. People nodded, people agreed, people retold the sermon until they swore they had felt a chill the moment he said the words. The slave owners, though, were split. Some feared her because superstition robbed them of rational thought. Others wanted to use her, believing a child who frightened other slaves might be useful in keeping them obedient. But none of them could ignore the way they felt when she looked at them. Even grown men felt a stutter in their breath, as if they were suddenly stripped bare in front of her. The rumors grew more detailed with time. A man claimed she once stared at a dog and the animal died 3 days later. No one mentioned that the dog had been sick for months. A woman swore she touched one of the child's braids, and her hand burned afterward. In reality, she'd grabbed the braid too close to the candle flame. But truth never mattered in a place reeking of paranoia, and the whispers only intensified when strange things started happening around her, things that were coincidences, but not in the eyes of a frightened community. A strong storm hit the plantation on the same night she had a nightmare. Chickens refused to lay eggs for a week after she walked past the coop. A master fell from his horse shortly after yelling at her. To people already looking for something supernatural, every accident became a curse, every wind became a sign, every misstep became proof that the girl was touched by something they could not understand, and therefore could not control. Even the slaves who loved her were not immune to fear. They cared for her, protected her, insisted she was just a child. But when night fell and lamps were blown out, even they whispered questions. Why did her eyes look brighter in the moonlight? Why did animals behave strangely around her? Why did bad luck fall so often on people who wronged her? Rumors do more than destroy reputations. They build cages. The child grew up trapped inside one made of other people's imagination. Every move she made was misinterpreted. Every emotion she showed fed a new story. If she cried, people said she was summoning spirits. If she laughed, they said she was communicating with demons. If she stared too long, they said she was casting something upon them. She learned quickly that silence was her best shield. A quiet child was harder to misjudge. But even silence can be misread when people want to believe in monsters. Soon, silence itself became another sign. "See," they whispered, "she doesn't speak like other children. That's how witches behave." What no one realized was that the rumors were hurting her more deeply than any punishment. She watched the world shrink away from her. She watched grown men tremble. She watched mothers pull their children aside. She watched opportunities close and doors slam, all because of something she did not choose, something she could not change. But the cruelest part of rumor-born fear is how it becomes prophecy. The more people feared her, the more isolated she became. The more isolated she became, the stranger she appeared. And the stranger she appeared, the more powerful their fear grew. Rumors fed behavior, behavior fed fear, and fear fed new rumors. That cycle would shape her entire life. It would lift her into legend and bury her in darkness. It would make Tennessee forget she was human at all, and in time it would push her toward the fate whispered the night she was born. The fate people believed she was destined for long before she had even learned how to speak. The doctor arrived after sunset, when the lamps were already flickering and the shadows had begun stretching across the floorboards like fingers. Plantation doctors were not men of science as people like to imagine today. They were men who carried saws more often than books, who believed in leeches, bloodletting, and curses as much as they believed in anatomy. And this particular doctor was known for two things: his shaky hands and his superstitions. He had been summoned because the master insisted the girl's strange eyes were causing unrest among the slaves. Too many whispers, too much talk, too many sleepless nights. A slave who frightened others was considered a threat, not because she could harm them, but because fear weakened productivity. The master wanted a verdict, something official that he could use to control the growing panic. When the doctor first saw her, she was sitting on a wooden stool, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, as if she already understood that this moment would decide, something larger than she could comprehend. The dim lamp illuminated her face in uneven gold. The brown eye reflected the glow warmly. The blue eye reflected it sharply like the edge of a blade. The doctor froze, not because he had never seen heterochromia, though he hadn't, but because the sight triggered something primal inside him. A belief older than medicine, a fear older than logic, a superstition that whispered to him in the same voice that had whispered to Tennessee for generations. Eyes like that are omens. He approached her slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might provoke something. Without speaking, he tilted her chin upward. The girl didn't resist. She had already learned that resistance only led to more fear, and fear led to pain. The doctor leaned close and peered into each eye as if examining a rare stone. His breath smelled of tobacco and stale whiskey. His hands trembled, not from age but from something unspoken. He asked her to follow his finger. She did. He asked if she could see clearly. She nodded. He asked if the colors ever changed. She shook her head. Simple answers, gentle gestures. She didn't dare explain that she often saw more than other people. Not magic, just details, shadows, flickers of movement. She didn't dare speak at all unless necessary. Then the doctor stepped back, and that small backward movement was enough to change everything. The master noticed. The overseer noticed. The slaves watching from the doorway noticed. A doctor stepping back is almost the same as a priest crossing himself. He cleared his throat before speaking, as if trying to find words that wouldn't brand him a fool. But fear always finds its way out of the mouth, and his did too. "There is something unnatural," he said. It was a single sentence, but it echoed in the room like thunder. He tried to elaborate, muttering about mismatched pigmentation, rare abnormalities, unusual reflections of light, but none of those words landed. The only one people heard was unnatural. It was enough to confirm every rumor, every whisper, every fear that had been building around the child since birth. The master folded his arms with satisfaction, as if the doctor had just validated his suspicions rather than his paranoia. The overseer whispered something under his breath. The slaves outside took a step back. Even the lamp flame flickered as though responding to the tension. The doctor wasn't finished. He insisted that her condition was rare, that it could be harmless, that it might be nothing more than a birth quirk. But Tennessee wasn't a place that welcomed uncertainty. People preferred lies with sharp edges over truths with blurred ones, and so every cautious word he spoke was twisted in the listeners' minds, reshaped into a darker meaning. By the time he closed his medical bag, everyone had made up their own version of what he meant. The master interpreted it as danger. The overseer interpreted it as disobedience waiting to happen. The slaves interpreted it as a curse confirmed. The doctor himself wasn't sure what he believed, but he left the plantation with a tightness in his chest, as if he had touched something he shouldn't have. And the girl? She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't speak. She simply looked at the doctor as he packed his tools away, and for the briefest moment, he felt as though she could see something inside him, something he didn't want anyone to see. That was the moment he broke. He rushed out of the room so quickly that he nearly knocked over a chair. He muttered a prayer to himself, and when he reached his carriage, he told the driver not to stop until they were far away. He never returned to that plantation again. But the damage was done. In the following days, the atmosphere changed. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Overseers flinched when her eyes lifted. Children prayed louder. Adults crossed themselves more. Even the animals seemed restless near her, not because she was cursed, but because animals respond to tension like tuning forks. The master ordered stricter monitoring. He didn't want her causing more panic. He didn't want her forming attachments. He didn't want her influencing anyone. It was as if the doctor's verdict had transformed her from a harmless child into a dangerous symbol, something that needed controlling, containing, isolating. And that isolation became the seed of her legend. People no longer spoke about her as a child. They spoke about her as a story, a warning, a whisper meant to hush others into obedience. "Don't wander off at night," parents told their children. "The girl with the witch eyes will see you." "Don't lie," masters told slaves. "She can look through your soul." Those lies solidified her into a myth long before she reached adulthood. The plantation doctor had not just given an opinion. He had handed Tennessee a weapon, a label that they would use against her for the rest of her life. He had sealed her fate without realizing it. And the worst part, he thought he was being cautious. He had no idea he had just turned a scared, quiet child into the ghost story of an entire state. The first fire started on a night that smelled of rain but refused to deliver it. The air was thick, heavy, almost swollen, as if the sky itself was struggling to breathe. The slaves had finished their work hours earlier, and the plantation was settling into that uneasy silence that came just before dawn. Only the cicadas sang, and even they sounded restless. as if something was disturbing their rhythm. She had been sitting alone near the far end of the quarters, her back against the rough wooden wall, her knees pulled close to her chest. She often sat like that, silent, small, unnoticed unless someone chose to see her. Her mismatched eyes caught the moonlight in two different ways, one eye soft and warm, the other sharp and cold. A few slaves passed by her and whispered prayers under their breath. They didn't look directly at her. They never did, not at night. Then it happened. A streak of orange rose into the air like a sudden scream. A spark became a flame became a roar, and within seconds the entire east barn was engulfed in fire. The blaze shot upward so violently that people believed it had started from inside, not on the surface, like the fire had grown secretly, waiting to leap out. The first person to shout wasn't a man but a horse. Its terrified cry ripped through the night as it kicked against its stall, the smell of burning hay already choking the air. The slaves rushed forward, forming a line to throw water, while the overseer ran in circles shouting commands that nobody could follow in the chaos. The flames were unnatural. They were too fast, too hungry, too bright for a barn that old and damp. And someone, no one ever admitted who, looked toward the girl sitting in the shadows. Someone saw her eyes glowing in the firelight. And someone whispered, "She did it." It didn't matter that she hadn't moved. It didn't matter that she was nowhere near the barn. It didn't matter that no one had seen her strike a match, carry a torch, or even stand up. Fear made its own truth. Later, after the fire was put out, the master stomped across the grounds with anger blazing in his eyes. The barn was half collapsed. The roof sagged inward like a broken ribcage. The animals that survived shook uncontrollably, and the ones that didn't lay still in terrible silence. The master demanded answers. No one had any. Someone mentioned lightning, though the sky had remained dry. Someone else suggested a lantern fell, but there were no lanterns stored inside. A third person whispered something about cursed children born wrong, and the master's face changed when he heard that. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply looked toward the girl, who was still sitting in the same place, still quiet, still hugging her knees like a child trying to make herself disappear. That look was enough to seal another chapter of her life. But the fire didn't stay a single event. A week later it happened again. This time the west shed caught fire shortly before midnight. No wind, no spark, no explanation. And once again she was seen sitting alone near the edge of the quarters, her eyes reflecting the blaze like two mirrors holding two different worlds. And once again someone whispered, "It's her." The slaves grew afraid to walk past her. They changed their paths, circled around buildings, avoided the places where she sat. Even the bravest men felt their stomachs twist when her gaze accidentally met theirs. They didn't see a child. They saw a warning. The overseer watched her constantly. He believed the fires were a sign of something festering inside her, something that the doctor's verdict had awakened. He called her it instead of she. He spat whenever she passed. He even tied a small piece of silver around his neck, claiming it protected him from curses. And she knew. She felt it all like thorns pressing against her skin. No matter how quietly she walked, someone followed her. No matter how early she woke, someone watched her. No matter how still she sat, they said the fire in her eyes moved. When the third fire struck, a small cabin behind the cotton fields, things reached a breaking point. The flames danced violently, curling upward as if possessed. Some slaves claimed they heard a woman scream inside the fire, though no one was there. Others claimed they saw shadows moving through the flames in the shape of hands. And there she was again, sitting far away, the firelight catching her face, painting her in orange and blue. The master didn't bother hiding his fear anymore. It had crawled out of him, raw and visible. He paced the porch all night with a rifle, as if expecting the girl to burst into flames herself. The mistress refused to leave her room. The overseer began insisting she be separated from the others. By the time dawn came, the plantation was divided into two groups, those who believed she was cursed and those who pretended they didn't. But no one trusted her, no one spoke to her, no one dared stand close. She became a ghost among the living, a quiet presence people avoided as if the air around her was poisoned. And she still said nothing. She hadn't said a word the night of the first fire. She hadn't said a word the night of the second. She hadn't said a word when the overseer spit at her shoes. Silence became her defense. It was the only thing she owned, Words could be twisted, but silence could not be punished without looking cruel. But the plantation punished her anyway, in their glances, in their whispers, in the distance they carved around her like a moat around a cursed castle. What no one understood was that she feared the fires too. She feared the way people looked at her. She feared the way suspicion clung to her skin. She feared the moment someone would stop blaming the fire and start blaming her with actions instead of words, because she could feel it coming. The fire outside wasn't the danger. The fire inside people, their fear, their hatred, their superstition, was much worse. And soon, they would decide fear wasn't enough. They would need someone to blame. The first time anyone noticed it, she was only 9. A cold morning had settled over the plantation, the kind where frost clung to the grass like a thin layer of glass. The slaves were gathering near the fields, their breaths rising in pale clouds. She stood among them, small and silent, her mismatched eyes fixed on the path leading to the stables. She whispered something under her breath, barely audible, something like, "Don't go today." No one paid attention. Children muttered all kinds of things. But an hour later, a stable hand slipped, landing beneath a startled horse. The man's scream echoed across the yard. By the time they pulled him out, his leg was crushed beyond saving. People remembered her whisper. No one mentioned it out loud, not yet, but a seed had been planted. It grew slowly. Weeks later, she touched the arm of an older woman who was leaving the quarters. The woman pulled back instinctively, uneasy with any physical contact from the girl. The child lowered her head and murmured, "Stay close today." Before noon, the woman collapsed while carrying water. Her heart stopped before she hit the ground. That time, people didn't just remember. They talked. Some said the girl sensed it. Others said she caused it. Others claimed her eyes saw more than a person should. A whisper became a rumor, and rumor became a story. And stories on a plantation travel faster than fire. One evening, long after the fields had emptied, she stood outside staring at the sky. The clouds were moving strangely, as if drifting in 2 different directions at once. She pressed her hand against her chest as though something inside her was tightening. A young boy was running past her, laughing, chasing another child. She grabbed his arm suddenly, not harshly, not violently, just enough to stop him. Her voice trembled as she said, "Don't run near the well tonight." The boy's mother scolded the girl for frightening him, dragged him away, and muttered curses under her breath. That night, the wooden cover on the well cracked clean through. Anyone stepping on it would have fallen straight down the shaft. By now, the stories were impossible to ignore. The overseer called it devil sense. The master called it manipulation. The slaves called it a warning they didn't want. The girl herself never claimed anything. She didn't boast. She didn't explain. She didn't defend. She simply moved through the days with the heavy stillness of someone carrying more weight than her small shoulders could bear. What unsettled people most was that she never predicted good things, only tragedies, only losses, only the cold shadow of death. It made her presence feel like a lantern that only lit up grave paths. Soon, even the smallest comment from her became terrifying. Once she refused to enter the cotton fields. She stood at the edge and shook her head repeatedly, her blue eye sharp with fear, her brown eye soft with sorrow. When asked what was wrong, she whispered one word: blood. The overseer forced her in anyway. Hours later, a cotton gin malfunctioned, ripping a man's hand open. The blood poured through the dry cotton like red ink soaking through paper. The plantation froze. From that day on, whenever she stopped walking and stared into the distance, people held their breath. Whenever she touched her chest, people turned to look behind them. Whenever she sat alone, people wondered what approaching tragedy she was silently sensing. Her own fear grew with theirs. It wasn't power she felt. It wasn't pride. She didn't want this strange intuition. It made her feel like she was drowning in other people's futures. She didn't want to know who would collapse, who would scream, who would bleed. Every time she sensed something dark approaching, it made her sick inside. A tightening, a coldness, a tug in her stomach like invisible strings pulling her toward something awful. She tried hiding it. She tried pretending she didn't feel anything. But fear, like light, leaks through cracks no matter how tightly someone tries to hold it in. One winter evening, she sat alone outside the quarters, staring at the lanterns. The flames shook as though disturbed by a wind no one else felt. A chill crawled up her arms, and she wrapped them around herself. She whispered a name, one of the older men who worked near the fields. 5 hours later, he died in his sleep. By morning, everyone knew. She had said his name before sunrise, before anyone checked on him, before the mistress even screamed. That was when the plantation crossed from fear into superstition. People began avoiding her footsteps on the ground. They refused to touch items she touched. They threw salt behind her when she passed. Mothers pulled children away, whispering that her eyes could draw shadows toward them. Even the master began locking his door at night. But the worst moment came on the night of a terrible storm. Thunder rolled through Tennessee like cannon fire. Lightning struck fields, the sky flashing white again and again. The slaves huddled in their cabins, praying for the storm to spare them. But she didn't pray. She stood outside, rain soaking her clothes, her face tilted upward as if she were listening to the sky itself. Her lips moved, but no one could hear the words over the roaring wind. When the master's son, who had gone riding earlier, didn't return, the search party found him at dawn, thrown from his horse, neck broken. People remembered the girl standing in the rain. People remembered her whispering to the storm. People remembered the look in her eyes earlier that day, fearful, distant, heavy. Nobody asked her what she had felt. Nobody wanted to know the answer. By now she wasn't simply a child. She was an omen, a walking premonition, a shadow in human form. They didn't see fear in her anymore. They saw fate. And fate terrified them more than fire, storms, or death itself. She learned to keep her gaze low, her voice silent, her steps soft. But even then, the tragedies kept coming, and people kept watching her as if she were the one holding death by the hand. Every plantation has a ghost story. She became one while still alive. The tale of the mistress who tried to sell her in secret is steeped in tension, secrecy, and the cruel contradictions of power that defined the antebellum South. At the heart of this story is a young enslaved woman, remarkable not only for her beauty and intellect, but also for the uncanny perception she held over those who sought to control her. Her mistress, a woman accustomed to wielding authority over her household, saw in her a dangerous asset, someone whose value extended beyond simple labor, a commodity whose worth could fetch an extraordinary sum in the shadowed world of private slave markets. Yet, as the story unfolds, the attempt to sell her clandestinely reveals the fragility of secrecy and the deadly consequences of underestimating the intelligence of the enslaved. The mistress, Mrs. Althea Crawford, lived in a grand yet isolated plantation house, surrounded by acres of cotton fields and a staff whose loyalty was more tied to survival than to personal allegiance. Althea was known for her cunning and ambition, and she was no stranger to using subterfuge to maintain her social and financial position. The young woman she sought to sell, Celeste, had become a problem in Althea's eyes. Celeste's sharp mind and quiet defiance had begun to unsettle the household. She had a way of observing her surroundings, noting secrets that others preferred to ignore, and subtly undermining the mistress's authority without ever overtly challenging it. In the warped logic of the time, her intelligence made her a threat, and the only solution Althea could conceive was to remove her entirely from the plantation, preferably to a buyer who would not return her. The plan was simple in theory but complex in execution. Althea arranged a secret meeting with a known slave trader, someone discreet enough to handle high-value transactions but far removed from public scrutiny. The sale was to occur at night, away from the prying eyes of neighbors, overseers, and the enslaved themselves. Celeste was to be taken quietly, her chains replaced with the illusion of freedom for the journey, to avoid alarming anyone who might interfere. Althea assumed that secrecy would guarantee her success, that money and caution could erase the complexities of human observation. However, the very act of planning in secret introduced vulnerabilities. In a household where fear, resentment, and survival instincts ran deep, no plan could be kept entirely hidden. Servants whispered behind closed doors, and even those outwardly loyal observed the mistress's unusual movements and unusual meetings with strangers. Celeste herself, intelligent and perceptive, became aware that something was afoot. She noticed the subtle changes, Althea's furtive glances, whispered instructions to the overseer, and the sudden, unexplained absence of goods and provisions that were typically plentiful. Though she was bound by chains of physical and social constraint, her mind was free, alert, and calculating. The night of the attempted sale was fraught with tension. Althea, confident in her discretion, had arranged for a carriage to transport Celeste to the waiting trader. But as the carriage moved through the moonless fields, a small but crucial detail betrayed her plan. A loose board in the fence allowed a neighbor's child to witness the movements and run home with alarm. The word spread quickly, as it always did in these tightly knit communities, and before the carriage had left the outskirts of the plantation, a group of local farmers and neighbors had intercepted it. The secrecy upon which Althea had relied crumbled under the weight of observation and rumor, and the carefully orchestrated sale fell apart. More than the practical failure, the psychological impact on Althea was devastating. She had placed her belief in control, money, and discretion, only to discover that these were illusions in a world governed as much by perception as by law. Celeste, on the other hand, emerged empowered, having subtly orchestrated her own survival. Though she could not outright defy the law of slavery, her awareness and quick thinking had prevented her immediate removal from the plantation. She learned to navigate the dangerous intricacies of her position using observation, patience, and subtle manipulation to protect herself while the mistress's reputation suffered irreparably. The failure of the secret sale also revealed the contradictions in the social hierarchy. Althea, a woman of considerable privilege, found herself powerless in a situation she had expected to control completely. The enslaved, whose humanity was consistently denied, often possessed knowledge and agency that the slave-holding class underestimated. Celeste's ability to anticipate danger, to read both the mistress and the surrounding community, highlighted an unacknowledged truth. Intelligence and survival instincts were forms of power that no amount of wealth could fully suppress. In the aftermath, Althea attempted to reassert control through punitive measures. She punished those she suspected of leaking information and doubled down on surveillance. Yet the damage had been done. Celeste's position in the household changed subtly but permanently. She became an object of both fear and respect, her mistress's anxiety a constant reminder of the failed plan. The household dynamic shifted. Althea could no longer exercise absolute authority, and Celeste's quiet resilience became a source of tension and fascination for all who witnessed it. Ultimately, the story of the attempted secret sale serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of control built on fear and secrecy. Althea's desire to remove Celeste from the equation was thwarted not by legal intervention or overt resistance, but by the subtle, intelligent navigation of a system designed to oppress. It underscores the unpredictable nature of human agency and the profound consequences of underestimating those who appear powerless. In this dark historical tale, secrecy proves to be as dangerous for the schemer as it is potentially liberating for the intended victim. This incident also offers insight into the broader societal mechanisms of the time. The illicit or secretive sale of enslaved people was not uncommon, but its success relied on absolute discretion and the complicity of all involved. Any lapse, whether a minor observation, a casual remark, or the keen awareness of the enslaved, could undo the plan entirely. Althea's miscalculation illustrates how human observation and intuition could disrupt even the most carefully laid schemes, challenging the illusion of control maintained by those in power. In conclusion, the failed attempt to sell Celeste in secret is emblematic of the tension between oppression and agency. It highlights the intelligence, resilience, and subtle power of those subjected to inhumane systems, and it exposes the vulnerability and desperation of those who sought to exploit them. The mistress's failure is not merely a personal humiliation, but a narrative that reflects the complex interplay of fear, secrecy, and human cunning in the historical context of slavery. Celeste's survival, in spite of systemic attempts to erase her, stands as a testament to the quiet yet formidable resistance that often went unnoticed in the pages of history. The event known as the auction where no one raised a hand remains one of the most haunting and enigmatic episodes in the dark chronicles of the antebellum South. At first glance, it might appear to be just another slave auction, a public spectacle of commerce where human beings were treated as mere property. Yet, the eerie silence that fell over the auction block when she was presented defied all conventions of the time. There was no uproar, no competition, no clamor to claim her as a commodity. The mass refusal to bid was not merely an economic anomaly. It was a profound psychological and social statement that revealed the underlying fears, superstitions, and unspoken truths of those present. This was not a story of simple refusal. It was an exhibition of collective unease, of a community unnerved by something they could neither control nor understand. The woman at the center of this event, Elowen, had long been whispered about across plantations and markets. Her beauty, unusual intelligence, and inexplicable aura had become the subject of private speculation. Some claimed she was blessed, others cursed. Some whispered that her eyes could pierce the soul, while others believed her presence brought misfortune. By the time she was placed on the auction block, these stories had traveled far beyond her home plantation. Buyers arrived, expecting a standard transaction, anticipating profit and labor, but instead encountered a presence that unsettled them in ways no law or tradition could explain. The auction began like any other. A line of enslaved individuals was presented in sequence, each accompanied by the trader's customary praises: strong worker, good in the fields, house-trained. The crowd murmured, evaluated, and bid, but when it came to Elowen, an almost imperceptible shift occurred. The murmuring ceased. Eyes that had been calculating her value suddenly flicked away, as if her very gaze made them uncomfortable. Her posture was unassuming, yet there was a latent power in the calm with which she surveyed the crowd. She did not speak, did not make demands, did not plead. She simply existed, and her existence seemed to have a gravity that unsettled everyone present. Historians later suggested that her effect was psychological. There was something in the combination of her defiance and apparent vulnerability that disturbed buyers. In a society built entirely on the subjugation of others, those who were normally treated as property rarely presented an aura that challenged the purchaser's perception of control. Elowen's presence on the block introduced a tension that was almost metaphysical. Buyers hesitated, subconsciously wary of the repercussions of claiming her. Superstitions, always simmering beneath the surface of the market, flared to life. Rumors of curses and misfortune, previously whispered in private, became tangible in the shared silence of the crowd. The refusal to bid was collective but not uniform. Some tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was expensive. Perhaps her health or skills were in question. But these explanations could not hold against the palpable unease that gripped the auction house. Each potential bidder looked at the others, hoping someone would break the silence. But no one did. Fear, anticipation, and superstition coalesced into a powerful social inertia. The more the crowd hesitated, the heavier the atmosphere became. The auctioneer, usually confident and commanding, found his voice faltering. Words of praise designed to elicit competition fell flat. The usual mechanisms of market-driven desire failed entirely against the intangible barrier Elowen had created simply by standing there. The mass refusal to bid also reflected an unspoken acknowledgement of her inner strength. Many buyers sensed, perhaps instinctively, that attempting to control her through the conventional means of slavery could invite chaos. Stories of her previous acts of defiance, small, almost imperceptible rebellions that frustrated overseers and mistresses alike, had reached the ears of traders. These incidents, minor on the surface but indicative of intelligence and will, lent weight to the rumors. Elowen had, in essence, become a living symbol of resistance. Purchasing her was no longer a transaction. It was a gamble against an unpredictable force that the buyers could not fully comprehend or manage. The psychological impact on the mistress who had brought her to the auction was equally significant. She had intended to remove Elowen from the household, assuming that public sale would resolve her own anxieties about control and propriety. Instead, she was confronted with the failure of social and economic systems to function as expected. The silence on the block was a public embarrassment, a testament to the fact that even within a society meticulously constructed around hierarchy and obedience, the unexpected could still assert itself. For the mistress, witnessing the auction's failure must have been a bitter reminder that power is never absolute and that attempts to commodify human agency can backfire in ways both subtle and profound. Eerie quality of the auction. Some describe the scene as ghostly, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the tension. The hush was punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of feet or nervous cough. In a marketplace accustomed to noise, bargaining, and the display of authority, the silence was deafening. It created a liminal space, a moment outside the usual flow of commerce, where fear, awe, and perhaps a hint of guilt merged. In this moment, the collective conscience of the community seemed to surface, reminding all present that the foundations of their society were, at heart, morally precarious. The aftermath of the auction further illustrates its impact. Elowen was returned to her mistress's household, though the dynamics had shifted. She became an object of wary respect. Her presence reminded everyone of the limits of power and the subtle influence of intelligence and perception. The mistress, meanwhile, became more cautious, realizing that overt control and secretive plans were not enough to dominate a person of Elowen's caliber. The auction's failure did not just preserve her physical freedom for the time being, it altered the psychological landscape of the plantation. A subtle yet profound recalibration of power. In a broader sense, the auction where no one raised a hand challenges the narrative of total domination that slavery sought to enforce. It exposes the cracks in a system that depended entirely on the obedience of the enslaved and the arrogance of the enslavers. It also serves as a chilling reminder that fear and superstition, even among those in positions of authority, can disrupt the most carefully constructed institutions. Elowen's silent defiance was both a personal victory and a symbolic statement, showing that agency can persist in even the most oppressive circumstances. Ultimately, this episode is remembered not for the absence of bids alone, but for what that absence signifies: the power of presence, the weight of perception, and the enduring capacity of the human spirit to unsettle even the most rigid hierarchies. It is a story of eerie silence that spoke volumes, a dark historical moment in which the very act of standing and being observed became a form of resistance. In this way, the auction transcends the usual narrative of transactions and exploitation, becoming instead a haunting testament to the ways in which intelligence, poise, and subtle defiance can challenge the machinery of oppression. The legend of the enslaved woman who became untouchable, whose very existence forced a plantation to erase her from their records, culminates in the event known only as the final incident that made her a legend. This was not a single act of defiance in isolation, nor merely the last in a series of quiet rebellions. It was a spectacle that exposed the fragility of the plantation's authority, revealed the limits of human control, and transformed her from a subject of oppression into a figure of fear, awe, and myth. The incident itself, brutal in its immediacy and enduring in its consequences, forever altered the plantation's hierarchy, ensuring that her presence could never again be openly acknowledged in the ledger of property. Her name, whispered across neighboring estates and markets, had already become synonymous with cleverness and an uncanny ability to navigate danger. She had survived secret sales, eerie auctions, and manipulations that had felled other enslaved individuals. But the final incident was different. It was public, unavoidable, and irreversible, a culmination of all her intelligence, patience, and cunning, executed at a moment when the plantation's social structure was most vulnerable. Those who bore witness described it as both horrifying and mesmerizing, a dramatic reversal of the power dynamics that had defined their lives for generations. The catalyst for the final incident arose from the plantation mistress's increasing desperation. By this point, the young woman had become more than a problem. She had become a symbol of anxiety and failure. Attempts to sell her, to punish her, or to confine her within the limits of household labor had all faltered. Each failure had emboldened her, sharpening her awareness of the plantation's routines, the weaknesses of its overseers, and the fears of its occupants. The mistress, determined to reclaim control, devised a plan intended to humiliate and reassert dominance. Yet in doing so, she underestimated the very qualities that made this young woman extraordinary. The incident occurred during a harvest festival, an event designed to display the plantation's wealth, success, and order. Enslaved laborers and their owners gathered in the great hall and surrounding fields, a combination of forced celebration and ostentation meant to project control. The young woman, whose mind had become attuned to the rhythm of the estate and the blind spots of those in power, seized this moment. In a premeditated act, she turned the tools of oppression, the overseer's whips, the mistress's orders, and even the social spectacle itself, against the plantation. The specifics of her actions remain shrouded in rumor, but eyewitness accounts suggest a coordinated disruption so complete that it left the entire household paralyzed with fear. Some accounts claim she orchestrated a near-catastrophic accident among the plantation's livestock, causing panic that spread from the barns to the main house. Others speak of her revealing secrets the overseers had hidden, exposing betrayals and corruption that undermined their authority. Most hauntingly, it is said she confronted the mistress directly, in front of the assembled crowd, with a combination of wit, silent menace, and calculated gestures that left even the most hardened observers unnerved. No one dared intervene. The spectacle was such that those who tried to assert dominance found themselves embarrassed, undermined, or even threatened in ways they could not anticipate. The aftermath was swift and decisive, but not in the manner the plantation intended. Rather than punishing her through conventional means, the owners recognized the impossibility of controlling or reclaiming her. They could not sell her, could not confine her, and could not erase the impact of her actions on the community of workers and neighbors who had witnessed the incident. In the private logic of the slaveholding elite, the solution was to remove her from formal records entirely. Erasing her name from the ledgers was an attempt to symbolically deny her existence, to pretend that the audacious events of that day had never occurred. In this way, the plantation admitted a kind of defeat while maintaining the illusion of order for outsiders. This final act also solidified her legendary status. Within the enslaved community, she became a figure of whispered reverence. Her ability to turn the tables on a system designed to crush her will inspire awe and hope. Stories of her cleverness, timing, and courage spread, passed from worker to worker, from generation to generation, eventually becoming mythic in their proportions. The very act that terrified the plantation masters became a story of empowerment for those who remained behind, a symbol of resistance that could not be erased even if her legal existence was. The incident highlights several themes central to the understanding of slavery and human agency. First, it demonstrates the power of intelligence and perception in a system built on brute force. Where chains, fear, and law failed to control her, her intellect and ability to anticipate reactions succeeded. Second, it reveals the limits of institutional authority. No matter how rigidly the plantation maintained its hierarchy, a single individual, armed with insight and patience, could disrupt the entire social order. Finally, the erasure from records underscores the tension between appearance and reality in slavery. Outward control might be preserved, but the internal consequences, fear, uncertainty, and myth-making, were far beyond the master's ability to manage. The plantation's attempt to suppress her legacy only amplified it. By removing her from ledgers, they tacitly admitted the impossibility of containing her influence. Among the enslaved, and even among some sympathetic outsiders, this act became evidence of her extraordinary power. They whispered that she had become untouchable, a figure whose cunning and audacity could never be documented but could never be forgotten. In effect, her erasure transformed her into a legend, precisely because it confirmed her ability to transcend the system that sought to define her existence. Furthermore, the final incident illustrates the intersection of fear and myth in human behavior. Observers, both contemporary and later historians, have noted that people often exaggerate the extraordinary in moments of terror or awe. The young woman's actions were magnified by perception, and each retelling added layers of drama and mystery. Yet even stripped of embellishment, the incident remains remarkable for the sheer audacity, timing, and strategic brilliance it required. In an environment where missteps could be fatal, she acted decisively and with foresight, demonstrating qualities rarely documented in historical records of enslaved individuals. In conclusion, the final incident that made her a legend is a story of intelligence, courage, and symbolic victory within the darkest confines of the plantation system. Her actions forced the household to acknowledge, in the only way it could, that she could not be contained, commodified, or controlled. By erasing her from the records, the masters tried to maintain appearances, but they could not erase the psychological, social, and symbolic impact of her defiance. She became a living legend, a figure whose story outlived the erasure of her official existence. In the annals of dark historical narratives, her legend stands as a testament to the capacity for resistance, the potency of intellect, and the enduring human desire for freedom, even in the most constrained and oppressive circumstances. The story of the Tennessee slave with eyes of different colors, one a deep, stormy blue, the other a piercing amber, lingers long after the events themselves, haunting the memories of those who encountered her. Known in whispers and fearful speculation as possessing witch eyes, She became a figure of fascination and dread, embodying the intersection of superstition, human cruelty, and inexplicable individuality. Her gaze, calm yet unsettling, seemed to pierce through the facades of the powerful, unsettling masters and overseers alike. In a world where slaves were catalogued, commodified, and stripped of identity, her eyes, so dissonant, so strange, resisted the totalizing grip of property laws and societal expectations, quietly asserting a presence that could not be erased. Her uniqueness became a prism through which every interaction on the plantation was refracted. Those who encountered her spoke of unease, of sudden chills and creeping anxiety, as if her gaze carried with it a subtle knowledge of their darkest thoughts. It was this quiet, invisible power that transformed her from a simple figure of curiosity into an object of deep cultural lore. Neighbors, traders, and even other enslaved individuals began to weave her into stories that blurred the line between myth and reality. Some said that her eyes allowed her to see spirits. Others whispered that she could foresee calamities before they struck. Whether grounded in truth or in superstition, these tales gave her an authority beyond physical strength, an influence that challenged the hierarchies of the plantation itself. The lasting significance of her story lies not only in the supernatural speculation surrounding her appearance, but also in the subtle, indelible ways she asserted agency. She moved through the world with awareness, intelligence, and caution, understanding that her unusual trait could provoke fear or fascination, and carefully using it to navigate the dangers around her. In a system designed to render human beings invisible and voiceless, her very presence was a form of rebellion. By existing in a way that was impossible to categorize or control, she forced those who thought themselves masters to reckon with uncertainty, with the limits of their power, and with the uncomfortable reality that not everything could be tamed or possessed. Her legend, passed down in whispers, tells us something profound about human perception and fear. In a society steeped in religious fervor and superstition, those who deviated from the norm, whether through appearance, behavior, or intellect, could become objects of fascination, fear, or both. Yet her story also demonstrates the quiet resilience of the human spirit. She survived in a world determined to define her by physical labor, social status, and obedience. Her survival, her ability to command attention without overt confrontation, and the enduring mystique of her eyes illustrate the subtle forms of power and resistance that can exist even in the harshest conditions. Over time, the Tennessee slave with the so-called witch eyes became more than a person. She became a symbol. Her eyes represented the unpredictable and uncontrollable elements of life in a rigidly structured society. They symbolized the ways in which human individuality, intelligence, awareness, uniqueness, cannot be fully erased by laws, chains, or cruelty. To the enslaved, her story offered a measure of hope, that even under extreme oppression, there were ways to assert one's presence, to claim a small but undeniable form of autonomy. To the masters, she remained a reminder of uncertainty, of the limits of authority, and of the consequences of underestimating those they sought to dominate. In the final reckoning, her life and legend endure because they straddle the line between history and myth. She cannot be fully explained, catalogued, or tamed, and it is precisely this quality that has ensured the persistence of her story across generations. The witch eyes were not merely a physical anomaly. They were a lens through which the complexity of power, fear, and resistance can be understood. Her gaze, both literal and symbolic, reminds us that the human spirit possesses an enduring capacity to unsettle, influence, and survive, even in environments designed to extinguish it. Thus, the tale of the Tennessee slave born with two different colored eyes concludes not with her defeat, but with a legacy that transcends the ordinary records of her time. She became a legend, a figure whose story outlived the attempt to confine her identity, a haunting emblem of the unpredictable, untamable aspects of humanity. In the end, her presence lingers, her gaze continues to unsettle, and her story stands as a testament to the extraordinary ways in which even the oppressed can leave an indelible mark upon the world around them.